The emergency klaxons echoed through the Galactic Council chambers for the 7th time in 3 days, which was approximately 6 times more than Admiral Crix had patience for. He stood at attention before the massive holographic display showing planet Xerion 7, watching helplessly as the quantum field readings fluctuated between extremely concerning and "we're all going to die." "The situation has deteriorated beyond our most pessimistic projections," announced Professor Quell, her 4 arms gesticulating wildly at the data streams. The Zentarian scientist had developed 3 new stress-induced eye twitches since the crisis began. "The quantum cascade failure is expanding exponentially. At current rates, the destabilization will reach critical mass in 72 hours. Ambassador Vorthan, whose species had evolved from professional pessimists, somehow managed to look even more gloomy than usual. "To summarize for those just joining our parade of failures, 3 solar systems, 14 inhabited worlds, and approximately 47 billion sentient beings are about to become very expensive space dust." Admiral Crix's mandibles clicked in frustration. "Remind me again how our most brilliant scientists, equipped with technology that can fold space-time like origami, managed to make this situation worse?" Professor Quell's eye twitches intensified. "The quantum harmonics were more unstable than anticipated. When we attempted to stabilize the field using standard resonance dampeners, it appears we accidentally created what our models now suggest is a reality-eating wave of destruction." "Fantastic," Vorthan muttered. "We've gone from a planetary problem to a galactic extinction event. I'd say this is the worst possible outcome, but knowing our luck, it'll probably get worse." Admiral Crix reviewed the list of failed solutions displayed on his personal tablet. Quantum field manipulators failed. Gravitational anchoring systems made it worse. Reality stabilization matrices somehow created a small black hole that they were still dealing with in Sector 7. "Sir," interrupted Lieutenant Brake, his voice carrying the kind of hesitation that usually preceded terrible news. "The Science Council has officially declared the problem mathematically unsolvable. They've run every simulation, consulted every expert, and tried every known method of quantum field manipulation." The room fell silent except for the ominous humming of the quantum field readings. "There's one option we haven't explored," Professor Quell said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Admiral Crix raised an eyebrow ridge. "Which is?" "The Deathworlders." The silence that followed was the kind typically reserved for funerals or really awkward dinner parties. "You mean the humans," Vorthan said flatly. "You want to ask the species that considers radiation poisoning a minor inconvenience to solve our impossible quantum physics problem?" "They do have a reputation for solving unsolvable problems," Quell offered weakly, "usually by ignoring the fact that they're unsolvable." Admiral Crix stared at the display showing their impending doom. 47 billion lives hanging in the balance, and their best hope was a species that had somehow convinced themselves their planet wasn't actively trying to kill them. "Contact the humans," he said finally. "At this point, what's the worst that could happen?" Ambassador Vorthan's expression suggested he could think of several things. Jake Martinez was halfway through a particularly annoying thermodynamics problem when his dorm room suddenly filled with shimmering blue light and 3 very official-looking aliens materialized in front of his desk. He glanced up from his textbook, blinked once, and returned to his calculations. "Excuse me," said the tall one with way too many arms, "but we are representatives of the Galactic Council, and we require your immediate assistance with a crisis of unprecedented magnitude." Jake looked up again, noting that his roommate was still passed out on the couch with headphones on. "Cool. Can you keep it down, though? I've got a test tomorrow, and this heat transfer stuff is actually harder than it looks." Admiral Crix stepped forward, his metals clinking impressively. "Young human, you do not seem to comprehend the gravity of our situation. 3 entire solar systems face imminent destruction." "That sucks," Jake said, genuinely sympathetic but still focused on his problem set. "But like I said, I've really got to finish this. Unless you're here about the RA position, in which case the sign-up sheet is down the hall." Professor Quell's eye twitches reached critical frequency. "Perhaps we should explain. Planet Xerion 7's quantum field matrix has destabilized, creating a cascade failure that threatens to unravel the fundamental structure of space-time across multiple star systems." Jake finally set down his pencil and gave them his full attention. "Okay, quantum field instability. That's like, what, a standing wave problem?" The aliens exchanged glances. Ambassador Vorthan cleared his throat. "The mathematics involved are beyond the comprehension of most advanced civilizations. Our greatest scientists have declared it unsolvable." "Right, but Is it a standing wave problem? Jake repeated, already pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. Because if the field's oscillating between stable states, that's just basic wave mechanics. What's the frequency of the oscillations? Admiral Crix consulted his tactical display. The quantum harmonics are fluctuating between 2.7 and 3.4 terahertz. Jake started sketching a simple wave diagram. And what's the field strength at the resonance points? Approximately 847 quantum flux units at peak, Professor Quell replied, bewildered by the casual nature of his questions. Frustrated. Okay, and what have you tried so far to stabilize it? The aliens launched into a detailed explanation involving quantum field manipulators, gravitational anchoring systems, reality stabilization matrices, and something called a temporal phase inverter. Jake listened, nodding occasionally, then looked up with the expression of someone who'd just been told that a professional kitchen couldn't figure out how to boil water. Wait, you tried to force it into a stable state instead of just dampening the oscillations. The quantum mathematics require precise harmonic alignment across 17-dimensional matrices, Professor Quell said defensively. Jake stared at her. Or you could just, change the frequency slightly so it doesn't resonate anymore. The room went quiet except for the humming of their various alien technologies. Change the frequency, Admiral Crix repeated slowly. Yeah, like if you've got a standing wave that's tearing stuff apart, you don't build a bigger wave to fight it. You just detune it a little so it stops being a standing wave. Basic physics, right? Ambassador Vorthan looked like he was experiencing an existential crisis. You're suggesting the solution to our galaxy-threatening quantum cascade failure is Jake shrugged. I mean, I'd have to see the actual setup to be sure, but yeah, probably. Can I get back to my homework now? This thermodynamic stuff is actually pretty tricky. 10 minutes later, Jake found himself aboard the most advanced starship in the galaxy, staring at a holographic display that would have made NASA weep with envy. The quantum field readings looked like a light show having a seizure. So this is your quantum field, Jake said, pulling out a regular ballpoint pen and a piece of notebook paper. Mind if I just sketch this out real quick? Professor Quell watched in horror as he began drawing simple sine waves. You're going to solve a 17-dimensional quantum matrix problem with pen and paper? Well, yeah. I mean, the math's the same whether you use a fancy hologram or a napkin. Jake squinted at the display. Actually, can someone turn down all the flashy stuff? It's kind of hard to see the actual data with all the spinning and the glowing. Admiral Crix reluctantly disabled the dramatic visual effects, leaving behind clean, simple graphs that suddenly looked a lot less impressive. There we go, Jake said, comparing the display to his hand-drawn sketch. See, you've got a classic resonance problem here. The field's bouncing between these two states because you've got natural harmonics at both frequencies. He pulled out his phone calculator, the kind that came free with the operating system, while the aliens stared at their quantum computational arrays, worth approximately 17 trillion credits. Let's see, if the base frequency is 3.05 terahertz average, and you shift it by, carry the 2, about 0.03%, that should kill the resonance completely. Professor Quell's forearms began waving frantically, but the quantum flux calculations alone require a minimum of 47 processing cores running parallel simulations across multiple probability matrices. Jake looked up from his calculator. Why? Because that's how you do quantum field calculations. But why? Jake asked again, in the tone of someone genuinely confused. I mean, it's just a wave. Waves follow math. Math isn't that complicated. Ambassador Vorthan stepped forward. Young human, our most advanced scientists have spent decades perfecting these methods. Yeah, but they don't work, Jake pointed out reasonably. And this is like sophomore-level wave mechanics. We covered this stuff last semester. He started sketching out a simple frequency modulation diagram while the aliens watched in growing bewilderment. Look, all you need is something that can adjust the field frequency by about 0.03%. What do you usually use for fine frequency adjustments? Quantum phase modulators, Admiral Crix replied automatically. Cool. Do you have any of those? Of course, but they're designed for much more sophisticated applications than simple frequency shifting. Jake stared at him. But they can shift frequencies, right? Well, yes, but... Then we're good. Jake made a few more calculations on his phone. Actually, you know what? Forget the phase modulators. What's the field being generated by? Professor Quell consulted her readings. A series of quantum resonance chambers arranged in a dodecahedral array. Right, so it's basically like having 12 speakers all playing the same note. What if we just change the tune on one of them slightly? The aliens exchanged the kind of looks usually reserved for watching someone suggest fixing a starship with duct tape. You want to detune one of the quantum resonance chambers? Admiral Crick said slowly. Just a tiny bit, like barely noticeable. That'll break the perfect resonance and the whole thing should stabilize. Jake finished his sketch and held it up. See? Simple wave interference. When the waves aren't perfectly in sync anymore, they cancel out the crazy oscillations instead of amplifying them. Professor Quell looked at the drawing, then at her 17-dimensional quantum matrices, then back at the drawing. One of her eye twitches had evolved into a full facial spasm. "This is undergraduate physics," she whispered. "Yeah," Jake agreed cheerfully. "Pretty basic stuff. Although," he added, glancing back at his thermodynamics textbook, "it's still not as tricky as figuring out heat transfer through composite materials. That stuff's actually hard." The moment Jake reached for what appeared to be a random control panel, every alien in the room simultaneously had what could only be described as a collective nervous breakdown. "Wait!" Professor Quell shrieked, her forearms flailing in panic. "You cannot simply adjust quantum resonance parameters without proper safety protocols." Admiral Creek stepped between Jake and the controls, his military training kicking in. The procedural requirements alone mandate a minimum of 72 hours of safety assessments, followed by remote testing from at least 3 star systems away. Jake paused, his hand halfway to what looked like a simple frequency dial. "Why?" "Because," Ambassador Vorthan said, his voice rising to near hysteria, "if your calculations are wrong, you could accidentally tear a hole in reality itself." "But they're not wrong," Jake said patiently. "It's just basic wave mechanics." "Basic?" Professor Quell's eye spasms had now spread to her entire facial region. "You're talking about manipulating the fundamental quantum substrate that holds space-time together." Jake looked genuinely confused. "Yeah, but it's still just a wave. Waves don't suddenly stop being waves just because they're in space." Admiral Crix began pacing, his metals jangling with anxiety. "Our standard protocol requires computational modeling across 47 different probability matrices, safety simulations running on 17 separate quantum computers, and approval from the Galactic Science Committee, the Universal Safety Board, and at least 3 independent reality stability consultants." "How long does all that take?" Jake asked. "Approximately 6 months," Vorthan replied, "assuming expedited processing." Jake stared at him. "Dude, you said you had 72 hours before everything explodes." The room fell silent as this inconvenient truth sank in. "Perhaps," Professor Quell said weakly, "we could accelerate the safety assessment process to a mere 3 weeks? Or," Jake suggested, "we could just try it and see what happens. I mean, if I'm wrong, you're all dead anyway, right?" The aliens recoiled as if he'd suggested sacrificing puppies to dark gods. "You cannot simply try it and see what happens with quantum field manipulation," Admiral Critch sputtered. "The potential ramifications could affect the entire galactic cluster." Jake pulled out his notebook and flipped to a page covered in equations. "Okay, look, the resonance frequency is currently at 3.05 terahertz, right? If I shift chamber 7 by 0.03%, that brings it to 3.04909 terahertz. The interference pattern between that and the other 11 chambers will create a beating frequency that dampens the overall oscillation." He looked up at their blank stares. "It's like," he continued, "if you have 2 people singing the same note really loudly, and one person goes just slightly off-key. Suddenly it's not ear-splitting anymore. Same principle." Professor Quell consulted her quantum matrices frantically. "But the 17-dimensional calculations show—" "Then you're overcomplicating it," Jake interrupted gently. "Look, I get it. You guys have this amazing technology, and you want to use all of it. But sometimes the simple answer is the right answer." He gestured at their displays. "Your computers are spending so much processing power trying to model every possible quantum state that they're missing the basic physics. It's like using a supercomputer to add 2 plus 2 and getting confused when it gives you a 40-page explanation instead of just saying 4. Ambassador Vorthan sat heavily in his chair. "Are you suggesting that our most advanced scientific methods are incorrect?" "Not incorrect," Jake said diplomatically. "Just way, way more complicated than they need to be. It's like trying to hammer in a nail with a nuclear reactor. Sure, the reactor is impressive, but a regular hammer works better." Admiral Crick stared at the control panel, then at Jake's simple notebook calculations, then back at the panel. "And you're absolutely certain this will work?" Jake shrugged. I mean, 99.7% certain. There's always a chance I carried a decimal wrong or something, but the math's pretty straightforward. 99.7%. Vorthan repeated faintly. Yeah, that's better odds than I usually get on my physics tests, Jake said cheerfully. Plus, like I said, if I'm wrong, you were all gonna die anyway, so really, there's no downside to trying. The three aliens looked at each other, then at their impossibly complex displays showing imminent galactic destruction, then at Jake's notebook with its simple hand-drawn diagrams and phone calculator mathematics. This is insane, Professor Quell whispered. Yeah, Admiral Crix agreed, but he's not wrong about the timeline. Ambassador Vorthan closed his eyes. I cannot believe I'm about to bet 3 solar systems on undergraduate physics homework. What happened next would be discussed in Galactic Council meetings for the next 3 centuries, mostly in hushed, disbelieving whispers. Jake walked over to the control panel with the casual confidence of someone adjusting a car radio. He squinted at the alien symbols for a moment, then looked back at Admiral Crix. So which one of these adjusts the frequency for Chamber 7? Admiral Crix pointed with a trembling finger at a crystalline dial that pulsed with ominous blue energy. That control matrix governs the quantum harmonic resonance parameters for the 7th dimensional anchor point. Cool, thanks. Jake reached for the dial. Wait! Professor Quell screamed, her panic reaching operatic levels. At least let us evacuate to minimum safe distance. What's minimum safe distance? Jake asked, pausing. Approximately 47 light-years, she replied. Jake stared at her. Then how are you going to fix it? The logic of this question hit the aliens like a meteorite strike. They stood frozen, watching Jake's hand hover over the dial that their most sophisticated models suggested could either save the galaxy or turn it into cosmic soup. You know what? Jake said thoughtfully. Maybe I should double-check my math first. He pulled out his notebook and ran through the calculations again, using his phone's calculator app while surrounded by quantum computers that cost more than Earth's entire GDP. The aliens watched in fascination as he worked through the problem like it was a routine homework assignment. Okay, frequency differential of 0.9 kilohertz. That should create a beat frequency of... Jake tapped at his phone. Yeah, about 450 hertz. That'll break up the standing wave pattern without destabilizing the individual field generators. He looked up at the aliens' terrified faces. You guys might want to step back a little. Not because it's dangerous, he added quickly, but because I have no idea what this thing sounds like when it changes frequency. Could be loud. Admiral Crix, Professor Quell, and Ambassador Vorthan retreated to what they considered a safe distance, which was approximately the opposite end of the ship's bridge. Jake shrugged, made a tiny adjustment to the crystalline dial, maybe a quarter turn clockwise, and stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the quantum field display, which had been fluctuating wildly between red and yellow danger zones, suddenly settled into a steady, peaceful green. The ominous humming that had been vibrating through the ship's hull faded to a barely noticeable whisper. The holographic representation of planet Zerion 7, which had been flickering between existing and not existing, solidified into a stable, non-apocalyptic state. Every alarm on the bridge shut off simultaneously. The silence that followed was so profound that Jake could hear his stomach growling. He said, checking the readings. That worked better than I expected. Usually takes a couple tries to get the frequency just right. Professor Quell approached the display with the cautious steps of someone approaching a wild animal. Her forearms moved frantically over her instruments, running diagnostic after diagnostic. The quantum cascade has completely stabilized. Field coherence is at 97%. Dimensional anchor points are holding steady across all 17 matrices. Admiral Crix stared at his tactical display, which had gone from flashing red warnings to the most boring green readouts he'd ever seen. The threat level has dropped to negligible background fluctuation. Ambassador Vorthan stood perfectly still for nearly 30 seconds, then slowly approached Jake with the reverence usually reserved for religious experiences. You fixed it. Yeah, Jake said, already pulling out his thermodynamics textbook. Like I said, basic wave mechanics. Although I should probably head back soon. I still haven't figured out this heat transport problem, and the test is tomorrow morning. Professor Quell looked at her quantum computation arrays, then at Jake's notebook with its simple diagrams and phone calculator math, then back at the now stable readings showing 3 solar systems that were definitely not about to become cosmic dust. 17-dimensional quantum matrices, she muttered to herself. Probability cascade modeling. Reality stability algorithms. She looked at Jake's notebook again. Undergraduate physics. To be fair, Jake said helpfully, it's second-year undergraduate physics. The first-year stuff is mostly just dropping things and timing how long they take to hit the ground. Admiral Crix was running every diagnostic his ship possessed, unable to believe that a problem their greatest minds couldn't solve had been fixed with what appeared to be a volume knob adjustment. The quantum field is more stable now than it was before the crisis began. Oh yeah, Jake said, glancing at the displays. Your original setup was pretty close to resonance frequency anyway. You guys probably would have had this problem eventually, even without whatever triggered it. This way it shouldn't happen again. Ambassador Vorton sat down heavily, staring at the peaceful green displays. So not only did you solve our galaxy-ending crisis, you also prevented future galaxy-ending crises. I guess? Jake checked his phone for the time. Look, this has been really interesting and all, but can someone give me a ride back to campus? I've still got like 6 more thermodynamics problems to work through, and this stuff is legitimately challenging. The ride back to Jake's dorm was perhaps the most awkward interstellar journey in galactic history. 3 of the most powerful beings in known space sat in stunned silence, while a college sophomore worked through heat transfer equations in the backseat of their reality-bending starship. Admiral Crix kept glancing at his instruments, as if expecting the universe to suddenly remember it was supposed to be ending. The quantum field remains perfectly stable, he announced for the 7th time in 10 minutes. That's good, Jake mumbled, erasing a calculation. Hey, do you guys know anything about thermal conductivity through layered materials? This problem's got me stumped. Professor Quell, who held 17 advanced degrees in quantum physics, stared at the thermodynamics textbook over Jake's shoulder. The equations looked impossibly complex. What course is this for? Engineering 240, heat and mass transfer. It's like a sophomore requirement. Jake sighed in frustration. I can never remember if the thermal resistance adds in series or parallel for composite walls. Ambassador Vorton peered at the problem. This appears to be significantly more complex than the quantum field stabilization mathematics. Yeah, tell me about it, Jake groaned. Physics is easy. It's just how stuff moves and why. But engineering's all about making it actually work in the real world, with weird materials and boundary conditions and stuff. Way harder. The aliens exchanged glances that conveyed approximately 3 months' worth of philosophical crisis in a single moment. Let me ensure I understand correctly, Admiral Crix said slowly. You consider applied thermodynamics more challenging than 17-dimensional quantum field theory. Jake looked up from his textbook. Well, yeah. I mean, quantum fields just do what they do according to the math. But figuring out how much heat actually moves through a wall made of 3 different materials, that's got like tables you have to look up and correction factors and all kinds of practical stuff. Professor Quell's remaining functional eye began twitching again. But the quantum mathematics are pretty straightforward once you realize it's all just waves, Jake interrupted. Like, don't get me wrong, the 17-dimensional part sounds impressive, but dimensions are just variables. You had 17 variables in one equation, which looks complicated, but it's really just one wave equation that got spread out. The ship's navigation system chimed softly as they approached Earth. You know, Ambassador Vorton said quietly, our entire educational system is based on the principle that greater complexity indicates greater intelligence. Jake shrugged. That's weird. Usually when something's really complex, it means you haven't figured out the simple way to do it yet. He held up his textbook. Like, this heat transfer stuff is complex because we're trying to model real-world situations. But your quantum field thing was just complex because you were using the wrong approach. As they materialized back in Jake's dorm room, his roommate was still unconscious on the couch, completely unaware that 3 solar systems had just been saved approximately 10 feet from his head. Admiral Crix stood at attention and delivered what was probably the most surreal military salute in galactic history. On behalf of the Galactic Council, 47 billion sentient beings, and the continued existence of reality itself, we thank you for your service. Jake looked up from his homework. No problem. Thanks for the ride. Professor Quell stepped forward, clutching a data tablet containing detailed scans of Jake's solution methods. Would you be willing to consult on future problems? We could offer substantial compensation. It depends on the timing, Jake said thoughtfully. I'm pretty swamped with coursework and I'm supposed to find a summer internship. What kind of problems are we talking about? Well, Ambassador Vorton consulted his diplomatic files. There's a spatial anomaly in the Andromeda Galaxy that's been baffling our scientists for 3 centuries. Something about gravitational waves interfering with subspace communication arrays. Jake brightened. Oh, that sounds like a standing wave problem too. Probably just need to adjust the subspace frequency to avoid the gravitational resonance. I could take a look at it this weekend if you want. The three aliens stared at him. This weekend? Admiral Crix repeated faintly. Yeah. I don't have any tests next week, so I should have some free time. Jake paused, struck by a thought. Actually, before you go, can I ask you guys something? Anything, Professor Quell said immediately. My little sister Emma's got this science fair project about orbital mechanics, and she's trying to figure out why satellites don't just fall down. Think you could swing by her school sometime and explain it? She's in 5th grade, so nothing too complicated, but she'd get a huge kick out of meeting real aliens. Ambassador Vorthen blinked slowly. You want us to help with a 5th grade science project? Only if you have time, Jake said quickly. I know you're probably busy with important galaxy stuff. The three most powerful scientific minds in known space looked at each other, then at Jake, who had just casually solved their impossible crisis and was now asking them to explain basic orbital mechanics to elementary school students. We would be honored, Admiral Crix said solemnly. As the aliens prepared to leave, Professor Quell couldn't resist asking one final question. Jake, what are you planning to major in? Mechanical engineering, probably, maybe with a minor in applied physics. He looked back at his thermodynamics problem. Assuming I can pass heat transfer. This composite wall thing is seriously kicking my butt. The aliens departed through their shimmering portal, leaving Jake alone with his textbook and the kind of homework that was apparently more challenging than saving the universe. Somewhere in the multiverse, 47 billion sentient beings went about their lives, completely unaware that their continued existence depended on a college sophomore who thought quantum field theory was easier than figuring out thermal resistance in series. And in a small dorm room on Earth, Jake Martinez finally figured out that thermal resistances add in series, not parallel, and moved on to the next problem in his legitimately challenging homework.